Good evening and welcome. I'm Trevor Morrison. I am the Dean of the Law School here at NYU. We have a long tradition at NYU of hosting world leaders to speak on important issues of the day and to engage in serious dialogue on those issues. And continuing that tradition, we are very pleased to welcome Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki of Poland here today. The Prime Minister will be joined in conversation by our colleague, Professor Joseph Weiler. Here at NYU, Joseph is a university professor, the Strauss Professor of Law, the European Union Jean Monnet Chaired Professor, and co-director of the Jean Monnet Center. And today's event is part of the Jean Monnet Center's Transatlantic Dialogue series, which draws to the law school distinguished guests from law, policy, and politics. Past guests have included a former President of the United States and former Prime Ministers of Portugal and Belgium, among others. We are pleased that Prime Minister Morawiecki will now join that list, and we look forward to the conversation. I would also like to thank the Polish Consul General, Maciej Golubiecki, who helped make tonight's event possible. And with that, I will turn things over to the professor and the Prime Minister. Please join me in welcoming them.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, Prime Minister.
Thanks for having me here. It's an honor. Thank you.
You heard the Dean. In that very seat was Mr. Clinton, two presidents of the Commission of the European Union, President of Italy. It's a long list. The reason I'm saying it is when the going gets tough, you'll know you're in good company.
Yes, absolutely.
We celebrate this year 30 years to the fall of the Berlin Wall. But in reality, I think we know that the cracks in the wall that made it fall did not happen in Berlin, they happened in Poland. And I think the whole free world owes a huge debt of gratitude to the Polish people for helping to bring about the end of that dictatorship and liberty to the West. I want to make a request to that. Let's pretend that we're in a concert hall, that the Prime Minister and I are playing a duet, and in the custom of a concert hall, let's keep the applause till the very end, please. Thank you. So, how old were you when all this happened in Poland?
I was 21, but even your definition, Joseph, on this Berlin Wall and when it all started, I don't particularly like, because the Germans did nothing actually for the communism to fall, and it was the Solidarity movement, the war in Afghanistan, and the intrinsic inefficiency of the Soviet system, which brought about this huge change. And they have captured this, this era through the notion of Berlin Wall. And this is why this is described in such a way. Whereas this all started in the 1980, while the Solidarity movement was established, or as Timothy Garton Ash, the Oxford historian, is saying, it started 1 year before, when the Pope John Paul II came to Poland, and he has actually encouraged Poles to oppose the communist system and to fight for liberty. And without him, it would not be the solidarity. Without solidarity, it would not be those cracks, as you say, in the Soviet system. So it all started in the late 70s.
Well, so then you were much younger.
But I still was active in the solidarity or pre-solidarity movement. maybe not so easy to believe, but having 11 or 12 years old, I was printing illegal leaflets and magazines and newspapers because this was the weapon of those times. I was an active member of so-called Fighting Solidarity, but the word fighting meant we were fighting with the weapon of those times, which was the leaflets, the free world, free speech. And this was quite effective because the Soviet system, the communist system, hated the free speech and free word. And year after year, more and more people were part of the solidarity movement, and the system was kind of undermined significantly.
So our time is very short, and I'm very grateful that you made time for this. But tell us one personal story from that period, about you in that period.
Well, I was interrogated many times by communist police, and maybe many times quite brutally beaten, but the most impact was the psychological pressure which was exerted on me by those secret agents, the Russian roulette ones. I don't know if there was a bullet in the gun, by the way, but at least they have pretended that there was. And when they were threatening my family, well, my father was in underground movement, and I have not seen him for 6 or 7 years. But I had 3 sisters and my mother, and they were the communist police was threatening me that they will do some bad things to them. So this was probably the most difficult experience for me.
And now you're Prime Minister. How did you become Prime Minister?
Well, maybe your questions about the 80s are exactly the reason which explained the later path of my life. I was doing some small and mid-sized business at the beginning of the 90s. Then I went studying abroad the European law. I'm an economist as well. Then I started to work for the public in the public domain as part of the European integration process, working in the accession treaty. But then I went to banking, and for 20 years, almost 20 years, I worked at a bank, and I became a CEO of this bank later on. But throughout those years, I was always sure that I want to be in the area of public matters, in the area of public affairs. So when such a proposal came in 2015, I left my job as CEO of a bank, which is quite an easy job compared to a minister and then prime minister, I can tell you.
Do you enjoy your job?
Did I enjoy the change?
Do you enjoy your job now as Prime
absolutely.
Minister?
Well, yes, this is what as Prime Minister and before as a Minister for Finance, I always knew this is what I wanted to do, but then I did some other things in the meantime.
So tell us, what's the best part of being Prime Minister of Poland, and what's the worst part?
Well, I can see that we are making huge changes in our economic model. We have been very successful economically. We have a kind of little economic miracle through successfully fighting VAT mafias. VAT is the main tax in Europe and in Poland. And through this exercise, we were able to gather lots of money, which we have spent on investment, on some social matters, and reducing our public debt. So this gave me lots of satisfaction, of course. And what was most difficult is that it's a very slow motion. In business, the decision is taken very quickly, and you can turn decision into action very quickly. In politics, it's not so. it's much more difficult. You need to deal with lots of different actors and dimensions, and sometimes it is so different from the previous world that this is frustrating, but I'm getting used to this.
So let's go back. When the Soviet Empire fell, there was some moment of euphoria, end of history. You remember all that talk.
Francis Fukuyama. Yeah.
But now, 30 years later, if it's not a Cold War, it's definitely a very, very cool war. And the first theme I'd like to broach with you is your perception of Russia today, of Mr. Putin, and in particular, do you perceive that there's a real security threat to Poland, to Estonia, to Latvia, to Europe as a whole from Russia? I mean, the Ukraine happened, Crimea happened. What's your sense?
Georgia happened.
Georgia happened.
2008.
What's your sense? Is it for real? Is there a real security threat there?
Well, I think so. It's absolutely real, even if all is relative and comparing to 100 years ago and 200 years. We have not only good experience with the Russians, as many of you may know from history. These days it's different because we are part of the European Union, part of NATO, and the world is different. Like 80 years ago, almost exactly 80 years ago, everything changed with the beginning of the Second World War. Poland, which was quite a prosperous country, was invaded by Germany from the west and by Soviet Union from the east, and for us everything changed. But since then, there are new superpowers on the rise, like China, India, of course the United States of America, and the relative power of Russia has weakened. So from this point of view, I think that the threat is much less visible than 80 years ago or 50 years ago, when the Soviet Union was the great superpower in the world, and they started 40 years ago the invasion in Afghanistan, and for us it was like the sign that, you know, the one after another, the countries, the states fall foreign victim to the Soviet Empire. Today, it's different because Mr. Putin is recovering the strength of Russia. He is a regional and global power, but through his aggression in Georgia in 2008 and then Ukraine, and the recent occupation of, like 2014-15 Crimean Peninsula and the recent events in the Kerch Strait, prove that they are serious in their plans to recover the empire. This is why we have to be vigilant. This is why we have to preserve the NATO alliance. This is why I am such a great believer in transatlantic community, transatlantic alliance.
My impression is, when I visit Eastern Europe, recently I was in Riga, for example, and I talk to them, the first thing that is on their mind is security. If I'm in Western Europe, in Spain or France or Germany, that's not a concern. Do you think Europe is taking sufficiently seriously this security? I mean, you're not being in any way an alarmist, but you are saying that, is Europe really taking it seriously? Sufficiently seriously?
No, it's not. The European Union as a whole is not, and the Western member states of the European Union are not taking it appropriately seriously. The expenditures on defense across the NATO members, which most of member states of the European Union are at the same time member states of NATO, do not comply with the obligation of spending at least 2 percentage points on defense. So they are free riders in terms of security. Germany, for instance, is spending 1.23% rather than 2%. France, 1.7%. There are only several countries, including Poland and Estonia, and the United Kingdom, and Greece, and the United States, which are spending 2 or more percentage points on defense. And the reason is that the states of Western Europe do not treat this hybrid war threats and the Russian aggression and the jeopardies coming from the Far East, from China, do not treat this with appropriate attention. So this is what we try to persuade them.
Do you think
to do.
in the current configuration of European defense, Europe would be able to defend itself?
Well, there are talks about the European army and the European defense, and we, in the new so-called multi-annual financial framework, which is the budgetary perspective for the European Union, we are going to earmark some amount of money for the European Defense Fund, or PESCO, which is Permanent Structured Initiative, Defense Initiative. But this is a very little amount of money vis-a-vis what is needed.
And
so
what the defense specialists tell us, that it's not just a question of expenditure. It's different armament systems, different communication systems, different munition systems.
This is the case as well. Like we have 4 different sorts of tanks, munition, as you said, and the harmonization of all of this is an effort on its own. But also the awareness and the willingness to take this bull by the horn and to be self-sufficient in terms of defense, this is a missing link as well. So Poland.
And do you think it's going to change?
It is slightly changing. So the Russian aggression from last couple of years is changing the landscape, is changing the awareness. Even if some countries still do not understand it. Like for instance, Germany building the second gas pipeline to Russia called Nord Stream 2 is actually paying for Mr. Putin's weapons. So paying for Russian gas is paying for Russia's weapons. And there is no such a necessity to buy Russian gas, because there is on an external rim of Europe, there is a capacity of LNG terminals to import gas from Algeria, Norway, the United States, and other directions on the level of 180 billion cubic meters. And this is exactly the shortage which Europe needs, 180 cubic meters and billion cubic meters. And this is exactly the same figure which Europe is today importing from Russia, 180 billion cubic meters. So we could have been more independent of Russian gas, but there is a lack of political will to do this, as Poland has done, because we are building the Baltic Pipe, which is the gas pipeline to Norway, and we have successfully built the LNG terminal, and we now have long-term contracts with American companies, with Qatar, and we are beginning to be independent of Russian gas. So I've immersed into Russian gas because this is how Mr. Putin is financing his army. So all is interlinked, and this is what we try to explain to our Western European partners.
So let me ask you a difficult question. Previous foreign minister of Poland was reputed to have said, he said it in more florid language, but because there are children here, I will be more polite. He said that he doesn't give much credibility to the American commitment to defend Europe yet again. Do you think that if aggression actually occurred, America would be willing to risk a third world war in order to defend Estonia?
I don't see any other power in the world which could be credible enough, strong enough, which could have its interests in Europe. So I think he was wrong. I think that the track record of the United States, beginning with the First World War and the Second World War, and then its involvement in fighting with the empire of evil, as Ronald Reagan was calling the Soviet Union, is giving lots of credibility. Having said that, I know that we have to be as much self-reliant as possible.
Isn't there a paradox here? Because in a way, your belief, and I want to believe that the United States would respect its alliances and do what's expected, but it's exactly that knowledge in Europe that if push came to shove, the American cavalry will come, which maybe allows them not to take the security and the self-sufficiency seriously enough.
This is why we are ringing this bell so loudly, and at many meetings in Brussels and in Berlin and in Paris, we are highlighting how critically important it is to actually have stronger and more harmonized European defense systems.
But is anyone listening?
More and more, yes. Well, I compared the situation today to what was a couple of years ago or a decade ago, when nobody was actually thinking about defense system and the European Defense Fund. The things are changing, but they are changing too slowly.
So let's just move to, you mentioned it before, but it's become such a paramount factor in geopolitics, China. So recently the European Union stated that China is, quote, a strategic rival. And yet, almost in the same week that that was declared, Italy joined the Chinese initiative, etc. So what's your perception of the role of China, the future of China, a relationship between China and Europe?
I'd rather live under Pax Americana than Pax Chinese, or what's the Latin word for this? Russian-Chinese Pax, or war. In those geopolitical struggle and tensions, we are absolutely convinced that Western democracies and Western world should stick together and defend our values, our liberty, the peace, and.
But you don't perceive China as a security threat to Europe?
Not as of now, but through the One Road, One Belt initiative, clearly China thrown the gauntlet to the United States and the rest of the world. They are trying to bypass the current trading routes through the Malacca Strait and Southeastern Asia, and to create a new connectivity between Europe and China. So it's an initiative for the next 20, 30, 40 years, and we understand why the United States administration is becoming more and more nervous about this. And by and large, within the European Union, a couple of weeks ago, we had this discussion at the European Council, which is the heads of states and governments, about China and Huawei and the threats of Chinese technology being actually amalgamated with Chinese secret service and stuff like this. So the awareness is growing here as well, and even if Italy has signed some agreements with Chinese governments, I think that there is much higher awareness about the risks coming from China, which is peaceful today, the development of China, but what can be tomorrow, we don't know. And as I said, I feel part of the Poland feels part of the Western democratic world, and this this transatlantic alliance, which was built after the Second World War, was a great alliance to keep peace and democracy and promote freedom, and it would be great if we could keep it like this.
So that takes me to my next theme, which is indeed the relationship between Europe and in particular the European Union and the United States, because you keep talking about this Atlantic Alliance, this Western family, etc. I've been a student of European integration and the European Union practically all my professional life, and I don't remember a period where the relationship between the European Union and the United States was as bad as it is today. It has many manifestations, but the two principal ones are in the matter of trade. There's, without ever declaring war, there's really a kind of trade war that is going on, with American threats to European imports, American moves in the WTO, which is criticized vis-a-vis the appellate body of the WTO, etc. And of course, you know, diplomatically, language hides a little bit the belligerency, but really in trade relations between Europe and the United States, I do not remember a worse period. And the theme that we touched before, the United States, rightly or wrongly, everybody can make up their own mind, is indeed very critical. It's critical about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. It's critical about the non-commitment of the European partners of NATO. How do you explain, first, do you agree with me that there's been a deterioration in the relationship? And what's your explanation for that?
I can only partially agree with you. Like, first, I remember the 80s. During the 80s, there were huge demonstrations all across Europe, in particular at the beginning of 80s, when with the Reagan policy, when he stopped the appeasement policy, the Soviet Union was able to actually stir up the hornet's nest and provoke those demonstrations against the Cruz, the Pershings, and so on. And this was maybe less between the European Union and the United States, but the European, between Western Europe and the United States, the tensions were huge back then. But coming back to your point, I do not agree actually with what you said, Joseph, because let's start with trade. Are persistent current account deficits, current account surpluses sustainable between different partners, like the United States and Germany, the United States and Japan, Switzerland? Those countries have persistent current account surpluses. So with their policies, they actually have a beggar thy neighbor policy, because they feel very well. They trade with they make use of this relative openness of the United States for trade, but there is not sufficient reciprocity. The tariffs in the United States are on average 3.3%, in the European Union 4.5% on average. The tariffs on American cars in Europe are 10% higher than tariffs on European cars in America. I don't want to sound like an advocate of the U.S. trading policy.
You are sounding
well, but okay, but
I'm just teasing.
You're provoking me. I provoke you, because this current account surpluses and trade surpluses cannot last forever. And when the European Union is accusing, and this is what I said actually on one of the last European Council meetings, is accusing the United States of protectionism and praising China for free trade, I think it's upside down. I think it's completely wrong. I came from the business world, and I know many CEOs and business leaders, and I don't know anybody who, in Poland, who was...
In a way, Prime Minister, you are now expressing an opinion on who is right or wrong in this, but what you're saying, at least in some ways, underlies my point. If the European Union is accusing the United States and praising China, etc. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, but this is what is wrong. This is counterfactual because
no,
China,
but
China.
even if it's
let
wrong,
me finish.
so I beg your
China
pardon.
is absolutely protectionistic. They do not allow businesses. Sorry for all my Chinese friends. They are stealing technology, and they are building their power on this stolen technology to some degree. Let's be gentle to them. And at the same time, I know many people who have established business in the United States, who are exporting to the United States. Actually, Polish-US trade is pretty much balanced, $7.5 billion each way. And with China, we have 2 billion of exports and 22 billion of imports, and similar disparities.
I don't disagree with that, but what troubles me is that there can be this breach in understanding between the United States and Europe on these issues. That's what troubles me.
Yeah, well,
and that's why. And
I wonder why.
How do you explain it? What has brought this about? Because after all, the United States negotiated its tariffs with the European Union. So what suddenly explains that it's come to a head? And there are some deep misunderstandings and mistrusts on the issue of trade between Europe and the United States. Without saying who's right or wrong, I tend to agree with you on China, for example. I wouldn't dispute that. But what troubles me is...
what about this example on cars, which I gave?
Yes.
No, I'm asking you.
Yes, and my answer is maybe the American negotiations in the last round on tariffs cut a bad deal. I'm sure Mr. Trump would say they cut a bad deal, but that's the deal they cut. So the question is, how do you redress it?
Yeah, I think it's time to sit around the table, maybe, between us, the Europeans, and the United States, and strike a better deal in terms of trade so that there are no those mutual accusations or petty protectionist measures from either side. And there is more and more of understanding in Brussels that we should go this direction. There was first a very outrageous reaction on tariffs on steel and aluminium imposed almost 1 year ago. But then some reflection came, and more leaders in Europe think along those lines, which I try to explain, that why don't we sit again and build the new foundation for the next era of trade.
And you're optimistic, because after all, Mr. Juncker
I'm cautiously optimistic.
Came to the White House. It's now negotiation, maybe a zero tariff agreement in trade between the United.
I'm cautiously optimistic. Well, like there will be difficulties in some sectors, like agriculture. I'm sure will be fiercely defended by the Europeans and in some sectors by the Americans as well, but I'm cautiously optimistic about this.
Let's just take one other geopolitical issue, which is, and again, it's in the context of European-American relationship, it's the problem of the Middle East, where it seems to be that they are not seeing eye to eye. The American recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, the recognition of sovereignty as Israel over the West, over the Golan Heights, etc., which is really contrary to the European positions, and Europe declared it
Western European.
Western European, yes. Well, the European Union in a way.
Part of European
Union. That's what I'm inviting your reaction to this issue.
Yeah, well, like Central European countries, in particular Poland, tries to be again an intermediator, if you want, between those two radical, or in particular some radical position in Western Europe, where there is this boycott and sanctions and divestment type of calls. We try to bring lots of common sense into this dispute, and recently we were able to calm down the situation a little bit, because with the recent discussion about Jerusalem as being the capital city and some embassies from Brazil and some other countries which were moving there. This has been very much criticized by Paris, by Western European capitals. And there was discussion again amongst the European leaders, and Poland and the Czech Republic, Hungary and the Slovak Republic, we were calming down the situation, not allowing tensions to grow.
Do you agree with the American policy?
Well, I think that all radical changes need time, so it probably be better to have again such allies like the EU and the US sitting together and deciding together on some stuff.
Let's move now to some of the difficult issues. We're celebrating 15 years of Polish membership of the European Union, and all the audience is invited later to a reception just opposite this room, and there are some posted on the very interesting and positive sides of that relationship. But I think today in Europe, if one speaks about Polish-European Union relationship, immediately what comes to mind are the tensions over the rule of law, etc. Let me give some context, and then of course the European Union has an article, it's called Article 7, which is there in order to call to task a member state which allegedly breaches the core values of the European Union: democracy, human rights, rule of law. I teach the law of the European Union, and every time I would get to this article, I would say this will never be used. This is there just for symbolic reasons. And then a couple of years ago, the Commission of the European Union, and it's not just one member, it's the College of Commissioners, started the process alleging that Poland is violation of the core values of the European Union, especially rule of law, independence of the judiciary. And then there have been 1, 2, 3 cases where actually infringement proceedings against Poland were taken for violation of the principle of the rule of law. In a minute we can talk a little bit, I'd like to talk a little bit about the details, but what troubles me here is that it's not a sporadic act. There's Article 7 and the infringement proceedings. A huge majority in the European Parliament supporting the opening of Article 7 proceedings. They sometimes say if there's smoke, there's fire. So before we go into details, do you think, or in the recent case, the most advanced case that's before the European Court of Justice, one member state took the side of Poland, Hungary. Do you have a feeling that they're ganging up on Poland?
Well, to explain this, I have to highlight some origins of what we are dealing with. Again, in 1989, there was a new system with the same old communist fellows, with the same old people. This is the judiciary from the communist times became the judiciary from in the new Poland. The same judges who have sentenced my brothers in arms, a lady, Ewa Kubasiewicz, who fought with me for democracy, and sentenced her for 10 years of imprisonment, the same judges were building independent and objective judiciary of the Third Republic of Poland during the 90s. So this was always ridiculous for me. This was always unfair for me. I always wanted to change it. I always wanted to bring more justice, objectivity, and independence. There were even more than 100 judges coming from Stalin times, still alive in the 90s and in the noughties. And until today, we have people who have been we have judges who have, and prosecutors from the darkest communist times who have given death penalties to our heroes. This is for me unacceptable. This is why always throughout those 25 years until I've joined the politics, I always wanted to have a deep reform of the judiciary system. That's the one point. Another point is that judiciary is is this the right situation if judiciary is selecting judiciary? Judiciary is judging the quality of judiciary. What would you say what would American society say if all of the sudden the president or the Congress would have zero say on the judiciary, and it was only judiciary selecting judges and so on? I think there would be a protest in your great country, and this has happened in Poland. The system was self-replicating, and the judges and judiciary felt completely beyond any control. So democracy is about checks and control, checks and balances. All three different branches of the broadly defined government, the executive, legislative, and judiciary, they have to control each other. Whereas in our situation, the post-communist judiciary was not controlled by anybody, and the quality of this judiciary, and now I come to the third part of my explanation, was appallingly low. There was lots of corruption. I could spend 15 minutes of quoting different specific cases at the very top of our judiciary, like the Supreme Court judge talking to another Supreme Court judge from another court, and they were tape recorded, unfortunately for them, and they were agreeing on a specific case in a completely illegal way, and nothing happened to them because they were judged by another disciplinary chamber of the same Supreme Court. Or a very high judge, well, like the head of a district court, was tape recorded by a phony journalist call and was asked by a prime minister, not me, my predecessor from the other party, to distribute a case to a particular judge, with which he agreed, and nothing happened to him. So this third area is the quality of the judiciary. So this is why in 2015, with the change of the government, and you need to know that it was actually almost the first time when there was such a deep change of the government for over the last 30 years or 25 years. There were changes before, but not as deep as this one. This was a Solidarity second revolution, second democratic revolution in Poland in 2015. This is at least as I view the whole situation. And how come Western European commissioners coming from completely different angle, how could they understand what was going on in Poland? So I was trying to explain to them what I'm explaining to you in a shortened version. We've prepared a white book. We've prepared lots of different explanatory documents, but then the whole situation entered into a phase of pre-campaign, because we are now approaching the European Parliament elections. And even if there are not 2 countries, there are 14, 15 countries which are on our side out of 28. But they are predominantly from Central Europe, because post-communist countries have similar pattern and they understand each other quite well, whereas Western European countries do not understand each other. If you allow me just 30 seconds, exactly the same procedures which we have implemented for the very important body within the judiciary system called National Judiciary Council, exactly the same. We've copied them, are in Spain. But ours are bad, the Spanish are good, and they are exactly the same. And the system of selecting judges in Germany is very much politicized. Politicians are selecting judges, whereas in our case, 2/3 of the National Judiciary Council are still judges. So we are much less politicized, but our system has been rejected by Brussels, and their system is good. Well, like for me, it's unacceptable. This is why we are fighting for the reform.
I'm not entirely persuaded, but
Well, at least to some extent, I hope.
I hear you. But let me challenge, at least to push back a little bit. I totally accept that there should be some political control of the approval of judges. Take the United States. The appointment of judges to the Supreme Court is a very political process.
Yeah.
But the big principle, and that is the criticism, I think, for example, in the ongoing case now, which is taking place before the European Court of Justice, once they are appointed, it's the removal of judges which is a problem, and political control. So let's take...
who removes the judges? In what country?
Let me describe and ask your reaction to the case now before the court, one of the cases before the court. So your government, the government of Poland, announced a reduction from the retirement age from 70 to 65, which meant that 27 judges, according to the documents before the court, would suddenly be retired. That's problematic.
Which is exactly what we've done in 1998, and nobody has opposed to this.
That's very bad, but it doesn't mean if it happened in 1998 that it's okay to happen in 2015 or 2017. And the case goes on to say that these judges will now, instead of having to retire at 70 or cut off at 65, the President of the Republic, who is a political figure, can decide whether or not they can extend their mandate or not extend their mandate, which I think most people interested in the rule of law and the principle of the independence of the judiciary would say that both of these aspects are problematic from the point of view of the independence of the judiciary. And Poland went before the court. The court issued an interim order, and I think we should be glad that Poland followed the interim order. But apparently now the Advocate General, and I suspect that the court we will see what will happen, will find that both these elements, the termination through the reduction of the retirement age and the political control of the president in terms of separation of powers, in terms of independence of judiciary, that he can decide who will continue, who will not, constitute a serious challenge to an understanding of the rule of law and independence of the judiciary.
Which the last point which you mentioned is no longer the case, because we've introduced some amendments to the law on the Supreme Court. But I can give you two examples of actually where we have enormously strengthened the independence of the judiciary. First, we have introduced a rule that all the cases have to be randomly allocated across the court judges, any court judges, Supreme Court, District Court, Regional Court. And the second was a ban on moving judges between different chambers, which was an indirect tool through which president of a court was exerting pressure on the judges. So those two changes were widely acknowledged as very, very positive. And
they are positive, but if we go back to the case that is now before the court, I really think that if we gave these facts to a classroom here teaching the rule of law, the students would say this is an egregious violation of the independence of the judiciary.
Like what specifically? Because what you said about president who can or cannot do something, this very provision was changed in accordance with the interim proposal by the European Court of Justice.
And that's very positive, but do you accept, because Poland is still defending the case, do you accept that that provision about the president was unwelcome? It was a mistake?
No, we defend specifically the right, which is explicitly written in our constitution, that we can change we can reform the judiciary system, and changing the age from 70 to 65, which happened in other countries of the European Union, is absolutely in line with the law of the land. This is what we defend.
But it might be that the law of the land is not in conformity with the principles of independence of the judiciary. In most countries, if there's a change of the retirement age, it would be prospective. It would say, let the judges finish their term, you don't cut them off, and the new judiciary, anybody who's appointed about several age.
And this is what we have restored. We have restored this prospective change. Well, like, this is now the state of the law.
As a result of this action, the infringement procedure of the European Commission.
Yes.
And there's another case which was started just 10 or 20 days ago about this new body, the disciplinary chamber, and the concern that the Commission expressed, it was a double concern, but the main concern was that disciplinary investigation and procedures could be taken against judges, even in relation to preliminary references to the European Court of Justice. And that is very troubling. Now, it's just the infringement procedure has begun, but if that is true, it's also a very problematic issue for the European Union.
But in particular, the lack of disciplinary proceedings and complete free, and the fact that the judges were never appropriately treated in the case of breaching the law before, has created the situation that 80 to 85% of the population stands behind us. They want to have a deep change in the judiciary system. Lots of this system was corrupt, so we cannot discuss one element after another and do not allow for a radical change. Like, for me, it's a situation comparable to the French one in the post-Vichy France, in the Prime Minister Michel Debré in 1958 and Charles de Gaulle have completely revamped the system.
But that was the right time to do it. But now we are 30 years after the change, and these judges, were serving under successive democratic government.
Sorry. He has done this 15 years after after the Vichy regime collapsed. We have started to do this 25. I wished we have started to do this 5 years or 5 minutes after the transformation began, but post-communist judges plus post-communist capitalists plus post-communist politicians, they have captured the land. There was a captive land to some extent.
It's very troubling, Prime Minister. Thank you. It's very... You were applauding me, weren't you? It's very troubling. Disciplinary chambers exist in many countries, but here the fear is that they will be applied not to a corrupt judge, but actually to decisions taken by judges. And what is of particular concern to the European Union is that there will be this threat of a disciplinary proceedings for judges making a preliminary reference to the European Court of Justice, which is the foundation of the protection of rights of individuals in the European Union. Would you agree that that would be a problem if this disciplinary chamber applied to decisions to make references to the European Court of Justice?
It's more complicated. Of course, all the courts have this right for preliminary ruling of the European Court of Justice. And many courts in Poland take advantage from this, and they do this. Sometimes there is an intrinsic abuse by some of the judges in the questions which they are posing in front of the European Court of Justice, and this is now subject of discussion, if this may or may not be subject to disciplinary proceedings. But with the strength of the judiciary in Poland, I would wish that there were more disciplinary proceedings for more important matters than this one which you're now asking or drilling into. Because there's lots of evidence that such disciplinary proceedings should be triggered, and they are not, and they were not.
The normal way is, if a judge takes a decision which is legally wrong, there can be an appeal to a higher court to quash it. I remember a case in France.
What in case of bribes? What in case of
bribes? Disciplinary proceedings.
Yeah.
But preliminary reference to the European Court of Justice is not bribes. It's a fundamental right and a fundamental principle of all European citizens. Now, I remember a case in France years ago. A lower administrative court made a preliminary reference to the European Court of Justice, and the Conseil d'Etat said this is inappropriate to make this preliminary reference. It's not a disciplinary procedure. It's simply a legal mistake. It's the fact that it's a disciplinary procedure which people find so offensive to the principle of the independence of the judiciary. Because really, if I had to say what is the most important legal provision in the entire system of the European Union law, it's the preliminary reference procedure. And if a Polish judge, for good or for worse, is afraid to make a preliminary reference because there's the threat of a disciplinary procedure, you're really striking at the foundation of the constitutional order of the Union. And
this is not the core of the reform. You're drilling into one detail of this, and I can guarantee you Polish judges are not at all afraid of asking anybody any questions they want. There was a completely different state in our judiciary system. They were beyond any, reach of other, controls and checks and so on.
I'm glad to hear that, but I would be more comfortable if in this reform it was made clear that the preliminary reference itself cannot be subject to disciplinary procedure. And I fear, just as I fear or I predict that Poland will lose the first case now before the court, I fear that this infringement procedure might also result in Poland being condemned by the European Court of Justice. And who needs that?
There are two cases in front of the European Court of Justice. The one where we have actually eliminated all of the infringements in their eyes, because we don't think they were infringements, but in the spirit of good relationships with the European Union, we have done this. This one should have been closed because there is no matter for decision. But the European Court of Justice, for whatever reason, decided to deal with this, even if the actual initial provisions, which were the reason for them to start this case, were changed.
It often does that.
It sometimes does this. Okay. And the other one, which is now the bone of contention that is most important, is the one about National Judiciary Council. And if you look into our constitution, what we have done in terms of changes with regard to the National Judiciary Council, we believe that they are completely in line with our constitution. Whereas there is case in front of the European Court of Justice, which is again attacking our right to reform the judiciary system. So they have found many different places in our reform in order not to allow us to make the changes, which we disagree with.
But Prime Minister, and then I think we should move on a little bit. The fact that it's in accordance with the constitution of a state in all member states is not a justification for violation of principles of European constitutional law. Many states have pleaded, but this is in accordance with our constitution, and they've been found in violation.
But let's explain to the audience, because you know, or maybe most of you know this, the matters of judiciary system are not the competency of the European Union. There are exclusive competencies, there are mixed competencies of the European Union, and there are matters which are exclusively in the competence of member states of the European Union. And reforming judiciary system is an exclusive competency of member states. So all what the European Commission is doing, they are building a very artificial and abstract construct to attack us in the area of judiciary system,
but
which we disagree.
But the court has held, and I think it's widely accepted, that the guarantee of a fair judicial trial for an individual in matters which pertain to European law is within the competences of the European Union. It's been decided in cases not only in relation to Poland. So my feeling is that it's a pity, it's simply a pity that these measures which run contrary to the common understanding of the rule of law and the independence of the judiciary will be taken by Poland and marring its relationship with the European Union.
It's a pity, definitely, that we were not able to explain the root causes and the reasons why we need such a relatively deep, but not the deepest in history, revamp of the whole judiciary system. But I spent lots of time explaining this to different commissioners, to the president of the commission, and actually most of my interlocutors have been in agreement with most of what I was explaining to them. There was one particular individual who was actually treating this as a springboard for his political campaign. And this is what is happening today confirms what I'm saying. And this is also, we cannot abstain from individuals and their aspirations, ambitions, and this is what has happened.
It's possible, but it's also, I mean, these decisions to take infringement proceedings are by the College of Commissioners. It's not by an individual commissioner. I would hope that there would be some second thinking in Poland. Root out corruption, but respect the fundamental principles of the independence of the judiciary, which is the common asset in
So
Europe.
you would want that we change our reform, which is widely needed and supported by 80–85% of the population, because of some bureaucrats?
No, not because... Not because of some bureaucrat, because of common principles of rule of law and independence of the judiciary, and I wouldn't call the European Court of Justice some bureaucrats.
Well, I'll go back to the beginning of our conversation.
Yes.
Well, like the institutions in Brussels, who completely controls them, Joseph? Who completely controls them?
You tell me.
No.
No, please.
People from Western European capitals, people who have started the European Union from those countries. They do not understand the intricacies of the situation east of the river Oder. They do not understand the need for changes, and this is why they today are against the reform in Romania, in Hungary as well. And this is what they have a different perspective. So we were trying to explain lots of this, what we now discuss, but they have completely, well, they are well, I'll be brutal even more. We are a new government since 2015, and the reason why we are new, and even if 80-90% of media is against us, 80-90% of big business is against us, 80-90% of all the big international political powers are against us, we have maintained the level of popularity which is very decent, and we still have good prospects to win the next elections. Why is that? Because we were actually dealing in favor of the widest possible groups of society. Solidarity was not an empty word, but we were trying to reshape our taxation system, our institutions, our judiciary system, and many other sections of the state in favor of an ordinary man. And we won lots of those battles. And this is...
I wish...
wait a second. And one of those groups which were put in an awkward position were also multinationals from Western Europe who have done a decent job in some areas, but in many others, not so good. I mean, for instance, they were escaping to tax havens and not paying taxes, having revenues and income in Poland, in Czech Republic, in Lithuania, and so on, Latvia, but paying taxes nowhere. And we have changed this. So they don't like it. And they have lots of friends.
I wish you every success. Truly so. You know, I'm a
Yeah,
friend of the Polish people.
But they have...
The reform should take place, but at the same time respecting the fundamental principles which are the common asset of Europe. That's what one hopes for.
We are respecting those. We are respecting those.
I hope so.
We are respecting those.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Do we have a few more minutes?
Of course, absolutely.
Still on this thing. Polish society is very divided today. Very emotionally divided.
More than American?
No. It's equally troubling here. It's equally troubling here that the society is so divided. One of the charges that are made is, you know, Mr. Orban coined this phrase, illiberal democracy. Is that something you subscribe to?
No.
I'm very, very glad to hear. Now there should be applause.
What is liberal democracy? Our predecessors, whom you probably would be praising and blessing and so on, well, like in the context of judiciary at least, our predecessors attacked demonstrators. The Secret Service came to media headquarters because they didn't like they forced journalists to be fired from magazines and newspapers because they were writing not favorable articles on the government. They were shooting to demonstrators during the manifestations. This was perfect liberal democracy in the eyes of Brussels institutions. This was, yeah. And now, when we are changing, we have changed. Demonstrations on the street, many of them, all peaceful. never attacked any media, even if 90% of them, 80 to 90% of them are brutally against us. This is democracy, okay? Never arrested people who were criticizing the president, the previous president. 6 o'clock in the morning, arrested by our predecessors. This was probably illiberal democracy, but this was not called like this. So lots of what is happening is in the words, like I think was Ludwig Wittgenstein who said, "The limits of my language are the limits of my world," and this is what was happening. They were called liberal democracy, and they were blessed by everybody, and no problem. You could do whatever you want, shoot to demonstrators and so on, with rubber type bullets and arresting, and nobody had any reservations towards this. We are not doing this.
Let me say something lighthearted. I remember I grew up in a family of 6 children, and whenever I was admonished by my parents, I say, "But look, he also did that," and she would say, "2 wrongs don't make a right." So I think I would apply
But
it.
they've done this and we didn't. This is a difference.
Well, I focused on what is really the challenges to the core values of rule of law, etc. I think we had a good exchange. Can I turn to another delicate subject?
Absolutely.
Since we are in New York, and that's Jewish-Polish relations. So now I want to start by making the following statement. I think it's outrageous when people talk about Polish death camps or Polish concentration camps. It's totally outrageous. Please, let's wait till the end. I think it's outrageous when people accuse Poland as a state or the Polish people as being complicit in the Holocaust. In fact, Poland is the only country except the United Kingdom, I believe, who never surrendered formally in the Second World War. And Poles fought valiantly alongside British pilots in the Second World War. So these things are really outrageous. But that law that you introduced with the criminal sanctions, etc., when you look back at it, do you think that was wise? I will say something else, which is important to be heard. The Holocaust was a terrible thing. Around 6 million Jews, of which 3 million were Jewish Poles. And everybody in the world knows that. But what tends to get forgotten is the 3 million Christian Poles who were killed by the Germans. And one doesn't talk about that. But my question to you, Prime Minister, is, was it wise to bring criminal sanctions against people who make these accusations, etc.? And you saw what the reaction was. Instead of really engaged in a campaign to bring consciousness to the story of Poland, which the Jewish story is an important part of it and should never be denied, but there's more to that story. When you look back at that initiative to pass that law, don't you have some regrets?
No, and I'll explain why. First, the Jewish story is absolutely part of story of Poland for several hundred years, actually, since the 13th century. And everything changed on the 1st of September 1939, where Germany invaded Poland. And during the Second World War, there were enormous atrocities and the Holocaust, what happened, and brutal killing of people. And there is an estimated figure of 300,000 Jews, up to 300,000 Jews who have survived the Holocaust on a broadly defined territory, which was Poland before the Second World War, under German occupation. None of those Jews could have been saved, could be saved without help of a Pole. Did you know this?
Of course, the largest number
No.
of
The largest number of righteous amongst the nations is 7,000. Is 7,000. When I say none of those Jews, 300,000, in the brutal circumstances of the Second World War, could be saved without help of at least one, but the war lasted for 6 years. So usually this was not one, this was more than one family helping Jewish family.
But
I'm multiplying this figure. And when I hear that there are 7,000 Poles righteous among the nations, with all the respect to Danes and the Dutch and the French, I don't know if you know the law which Germans introduced in Poland, which was occupied. All the families who have helped with the leaf of bread, giving the shelter to any Jew, were killed. All the villages were pacified, were completely annihilated.
But that is the story, exactly the story that you're telling now is the story that should be told.
Yeah, I was going to finish this with a conclusion, and then you can drill more deeply into it. And yet people say, as you intervened, 7,000. 7,000 is not telling the truth about the Second World War. The Second World War, a Jew who met a German during the Second World War is a dead Jew, was a dead Jew, was killed immediately. This is why you do not see stories of Jews about the Germans, good or bad. You see, you know stories about Jews, about Poles. Some Poles, Schmalzowniks, some who have betrayed, some bad Poles, because a Jew who met a Pole had a chance to survive. A Jew who met a German did not have a chance to survive, was always killed, with family, with Polish family hiding, and so on. And now to nowadays. And during the times of communism, Germans wisely and smartly started to change this terrible genocide which they have prepared and executed. They started to call the camps which were located in occupied Poland, Polish death camps, Polish concentration camps. This started in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Poland was, during those times, as some historians say, in a freeze between 1945 and 1989. We did not have a democratic government who would be defending our right. This was not on our agenda. We were part of a Soviet empire. And this is why the Germans and the Austrians, who are equally responsible for what has happened, they were year after year fending off this stigma of being responsible for Holocaust. You know what? Recently, the Germans, this is very much connected with what I'm trying to explain, so bear with me. What the Germans and the Austrians and the Germans did in two concentration camps, Dachau and Buchenwald, over the last couple of years, during the refugee crisis, as we call it, migration crisis, as we call it in Europe. They have turned the two death camps into refugee camps, just to change the perception of the external world. They brought people from Afghanistan, Iraq, and they put in the barracks. I don't know if the same barracks, but to the same places, Dachau and Buchenwald, where 150, 200,000 people were brutally murdered by the Nazis, by the Germans.
They might try to do that, but everybody knows the truth about that. The
I'm not so sure everybody knows the truth about this. I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure.
I don't think that anybody in the world does not know the truth about the German genocidal project under National Socialism.
So now to the law.
But no,
because you
but
started
what
with
I
this.
want to say is, the kind of story you tell is worth telling. I felt that the law that was enacted was counterproductive.
Now, okay,
And
I
eventually
close
it was
this.
changed.
But the law was changed with the declaration which Bibi Netanyahu and myself, we have signed in the June of the last year. And I make a reference to this declaration to all of you. I encourage all of you to look into this declaration, because this is what the Prime Minister of Israel and Prime Minister of Poland signed as a kind of common version of what has happened during the Second World War and after. And I can tell you, we would have never been in a position to work out and sign such a declaration without this law. So I understand that this law was stirring up the hornet's nest and creating lots of uneasiness all around the globe. And I wish the change which we have started, the explanations which we have started, could have happened without this law. This would be my theoretical wish. But we were unable to get to the external world with this very truth. We were fighting with the Germans, which was completely upside down, which their Die Welt, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, were writing in their articles Polish death camps, Polish concentration, Polish Gestapo, Polish SS. There was never Polish Gestapo, never Polish SS.
Of course not, of course not.
You know this, you know this.
I think most people know that.
I hope so, but I'm not so sure.
Tell me how you think about Polish-Jewish relations today in Poland.
I'm not. If you saw the recent report of the Brussels think tank on anti-Semitic occurrences, Poland is one of very few countries where there is a significant drop of those, and any such an occurrence is
how prevalent is anti-Jewish feeling in Poland today?
And in France and in Germany. Oh, wait a second. In France and Germany, those events, those occurrences are going up. So now, going back to your question, this is the proof in the eating. This is
Prime Minister, I'm asking it in a truly friendly spirit.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think there's a problem?
No, I don't see such a problem as anti-Semitism in Poland. I don't see such a problem. This is on a margin in every society. There is such a problem, but I don't see this today in Poland. We have actually invested a lot also in this Polish-Israeli, Polish-Jewish friendship, in investing also in lots of synagogues, cemeteries, and the Jewish cultural life. And the Jews in Poland, they acknowledge this. So the relationship are better and better, I would say, are good, quite good, very good.
Poles are very, very touchy when some of the issues of, even after the Second World War, are raised in terms of Polish-Jewish relationship. It seems to me that, given the balance of things, why not just address them openly and not be so defensive about that?
Because this, I agree with you, this option to talk
it's
openly and so on.
yeah.
Purifying, yes, but this has only started last couple of years. During the 90s, and it would be a long story, I would have to explain why, it was a similar situation like during the communist times. We were in a freeze, so we were not dealing with this issue appropriately in a purifying way, as you said. It should have been done when the Free Poland started in 1989, but it's not started.
I'm told that you have to leave.
No, I can discuss for.
You still have a few more minutes?
I think so. Yeah. Well.
I hope that your optimism will really be realized in relation to this delicate issue. Can we talk a few minutes about Brexit?
Yes. Yeah.
Do you feel that the European Union, I mean, what Britain did is a tragedy. I think it's a tragedy for Britain. I think it's a tragedy for the European Union. It's a pity. Do you think the negotiations were handled well on the side of the Union? I remember reading some time ago that maybe even Poland was involved, maybe offering a solution to the backstop, which would enable the smooth passage through the British Parliament. Do you think the Union handled its negotiations in the best possible way?
Well, first, I regret that Brexit happened. I wish that the United Kingdom stayed as part of the European Union, because we don't need those divisions, and the European Union, which is deprived of its key member state, one of the critically important member states. But I respect the decision of the British nation. There was 7.5 million people voting in favor of leave, and 16.1 million people voting in favor of remain. And since then, the negotiations started, and I was one of those leaders of the European Union who always wanted to give more time for the United Kingdom to reflect, to stay, and in particular, I wanted to avoid hard Brexit. And there still are leaders in the European Union who want the Brexit happen even in the form of no-deal Brexit, whereas I believe that this could be a very dangerous, like a Minsky moment, Lehman Brothers moment, and a big crisis could start if Brexit happened on a no-deal basis. This is why a couple of days ago, we have decided to give another 6 months' time to overcome this ratification crisis and to reflect for the British political class to reflect on Brexit.
I think your consul is telling us something.
Okay,
so Prime Minister, we had some tense moments, but I really appreciate your candor.
Thank you. Thank you.
On some issues we agree, on some issues we agree to disagree.
Yes.
But I think this was an instructive and educational and interesting things. I wish all the best to the Polish people and the Polish nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.